All right, so with that being said, and me stuttering a bunch, I'm just gonna get started here with this ON1 Live webinar. So we're gonna start with this photograph right here. And it's just sort of your basic photograph of a nice little Christmas decoration. And we have some light in the background, some nice bokeh in here. So basically we have sort of a still life portrait of this little guy climbing this tree and sort of handing a decoration to this other little person. So let's go in here and really just bring out all of the holiday style within this shot. So I have this photograph here. I'm just going to head into the edit module. So inside of the edit module, the first thing I'd want to do to this shot is I just want to crop it a little bit. We probably could bring out the tones first and then crop, but I was playing with it earlier. And this little area on the bottom here, this bottom right corner, was probably the only distracting area on the frame. So I'm just going to click out to zoom out, and I'll just hit C on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my crop tool. So now with the crop tool selected, I'm just going to leave the 2:3 preset. That's probably the original ratio for the shot. And then I'm just going to pull in on this corner here, and then I'll pull up and over a little bit. Sweet. And so now we have this area cropped, and then I've sort of aligned this tree with this bottom left intersecting point for rule of thirds, and then this top left intersecting point for rule of thirds. And then the background area, there's that top right intersecting area of rule of thirds. So that has sort of an interesting framing for the shot now. So we can just hit enter. And now we have that area removed, so it's not distracting on our photo. And so inside of our tone and color pane, for these holiday look photos, I'm not really going to talk too much about using different sliders. I'm basically going to go in here and we're going to modify a camera profile or use AI Match or AI Auto. Mainly this webinar is focused on using different filters and adjustments and textures and things like that to really sort of bring out the life in your photos and give them that holiday look. Inside Photo Raw, it's really easy to bring out the basic look of your shot. You know, inside tone and color, one of my favorite things to do with raw photos, it has to be a raw photo for you to actually have the camera profile menu there. But playing with these different camera profiles is a really great way to bring out just a foundational look in your shot really easily. One of my favorites is the ON1 landscape. Obviously, this photo is really, really underexposed, so the ON1 landscape isn't going to look that amazing, but we're definitely going to use the ON1 landscape camera profile in the other two shots. So for this particular photograph, I think I'm going to head down here, and I'm going to go down to camera neutral. And the reason I want camera neutral is because it basically just, it lightens up the image a little bit. So if I hit the /K on my keyboard, it lightens up the image a little bit. It kind of neutralizes the contrast. And so now I sort of have a better base foundation that I can work with. And inside my tone area, I'm actually not going to modify too many of these sliders. I'm only going to actually modify, well, 4. So the first slider we're going to modify is the exposure slider. And so we're going to pull up on the exposure. And we're just going to set sort of our foundational look. We don't want it incredibly bright, but we don't want it incredibly dark. And a great way to actually correct exposure on your photographs is just to hit the J key on your keyboard. So holding down the J key on your keyboard is going to show you your clipping warnings. So if I pull up on my exposure slider, and I pull up on it quite a bit, I can see that up in these areas in the top right, this is showing me my true white without any detail. So this is basically a blown out area in my scene. So I'm pulling up on the exposure until I see just that, you know, like just a little bit of that blown out area. It's not incredibly bad to have a little bit of true white in your photograph, but if you know, especially with a photograph like this where we can easily take it off, I'd recommend it, but it's definitely not the worst thing to have a little blown out area in your shot. But we're gonna tone it down so that it's just below the blown out white. So about 1.7 right there. And so now we brought up our exposure for the shot and we brightened the entire photograph. So this is a little bit flat now. So anytime we're going to be pulling up on a brightness slider like exposure, our midtones, or our shadows, we're going to be removing contrast from our photo. So what we can do to fix that is just pull up on the slider and then add in contrast kind of as we go. One way that I like to do is I'll pull up on kind of the sliders that I'm going to use to brighten the image. So for this particular photograph, I'm going to raise the exposure slider. And then I'll raise my midtones. That's going to brighten up my midtones a little bit. So now I can see a little bit more of these grays, especially in the tree here. But you can see that by pulling up on these sliders, the exposure and the midtones, I'm removing a lot of that contrast. So once I've pulled up on these sliders, I can head down into my contrast slider And again, I'm going to hold down my J key, and that's going to show me my clipping warnings. And then I'll pull up on my contrast until I get just a little bit of true black. Probably about right there, like maybe just a little bit less than true black. And then I'm going to head down into my shadow slider here, and I'm going to pull it up just a hair. Maybe about 5. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we have a nice foundational look for our shot. I think it's incredibly warm. So what we could do now is just head down to our color area, and I'm going to click on Kelvin. So it's like Kelvin. And then I'm just going to pull over a little bit. And that's going to bring some of those blues kind of back into the frame, especially into this little guy right there. And I think that looks a lot better as far as a foundational look goes. So now we can actually go in here and start adding the different textures and filters and things to sort of bring out that holiday style within the shot. All right. Okay, so to bring out the holiday look in the photo, I'm gonna go into the effects tab. I'm gonna add a filter. And the first filter I want to add, I'm actually gonna bring in a snowy look onto the shot, but I don't want it to be very prominent in the frame. It's just sort of a subtle snowy look will add a lot onto this photo. So I'm just gonna go into the weather filter here. And inside the weather filter, I'm gonna go to my texture, and I'm gonna go down to catch one on your tongue. So if I click on that, it actually does look really nice just like that kind of on the photograph, but it's pretty strong and kind of looks unnatural and not really believable. So what I do with these weather filters, especially with a photograph like this where there's not a whole lot of contrast in it, it's kind of a little bit flat still. What we can do to add in contrast and add in snow is we can use a blending mode. So in this weather filter, I'm going to go up to my blending options here. I'm going to click in this gear icon. And now I'll go down to my mode, and I'll head down to overlay. So what overlay is doing is it's overlaying this weather filter onto my shot. And whenever you use a blend mode like overlay, it's going to add contrast onto your image. So you can see that by turning this weather filter off and on, it's overlaying the weather onto the shot, but it's also creating a ton of contrast and darkening up a lot of the areas in the photo. Well, what I do with this now is I'll head down to my opacity slider, and I'll pull over on it till it's at 0. And then I'll just incrementally pull it up. And that'll incorporate the contrast back into the shot, but it will also incorporate, excuse me, a little bit of the snowy texture to kind of give it a feeling that it was snowing in the scene. So I can pull up on this a little bit, maybe to 50 or so, 35. Sweet, I think that looks pretty good. And now we have this kind of snowy texture around them. That looks good, just like that. So now what we need to do is we need to go in here, and I want to add another filter that brings some more texture onto the shot. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add the sun flare filter. So the sun flare filter, besides adding on sun flares and sun stars on your shot, you can actually use it to add in bokeh. So in the sun flare filter, I'm just going to go into my type. I'm going to choose bokeh. And now I can choose bokeh textures underneath that in the texture menu. So I'll head down here and I'll just choose bokeh. Boom, bokeh 10. And so if I turn this off and on, I really like what it does to the shot, especially in these corners. There's kind of this large tonal area up in this top left corner that it looks really good on with the 2 bokehs right there. But it's kind of covering up the subject in our shot. So an easy way to mask this out is to use a masking bug. So to grab our masking bug, I'm just going to hit M on my keyboard. So M will grab your masking bug. And one of my favorite things to do with a gradient masking tool like a masking bug is to use the center shape. So if I go up to my top tool modifier bar here, I'm going to click in my shape menu, and I'm going to choose center. And the reason I want to choose center is because if I drop this down, it's going to protect everything inside of the mask. So you can see that inside of this mask here, it's protecting everywhere within the solid lines. And then everywhere outside of that is getting that sun flare filter or that bokeh texture applied to it. So what we can do here is we can feather this in, or not feather this in, we can pull this in quite a bit. and just place this on this little guy and his little girlfriend there. Maybe move this over a little bit. Kind of like that. And then we'll make it a little bit smaller. So now we have this area right here, and that's the only area that's getting protected from the sunflower filter. But if we pull up on these perforated edges, we can feather this, and it will almost create a vignette-like look for that bokeh on our shot. So now if I turn this sunflower filter off and on, see how we can still see all of the area of detail in the scene, and it's now just masking out and kind of just blending that bokeh texture. And so now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboards, in just a few minutes, really adding sort of a basic holiday look onto the shot. So those are a few different ways. It's especially to use your weather filter and your sunflower filter to add in contrast to your shot. That weather filter, I really do love adding in that overlay blend mode with that, because it really doesn't add in contrast, and then it also brings in that sort of snowy texture onto the shot as well. So I think one last filter I could add onto this photo. We'll just add a vignette filter, and I'll use Big Softy. So now if I turn this off and on here, that sort of dims down these areas where it got a little bit too hot or a little bit too bright with that bokeh texture. So now we're a lot more focused on just sort of this middle area in here. And one thing we could do here with this photo is we could kind of boost these middle areas specifically. So if I add a filter, we'll just add a curves filter, and I'll just boost the midtones like that. So now we have these midtones being boosted, but it's being applied to the entire photo, and we want to selectively apply this. Well, we don't actually have to use a masking tool right now. We can actually just copy a mask that we used earlier. So I'm going to go into my sunflower filter, into the masking options. I'll copy that mask, and then I'll go back into my curves filter, into the masking options. And then if I paste this, now I'll invert it. And if I turn this off and on, it does a good job of brightening this area up and kind of bringing the light back into that scene. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, pretty quick way just to bring in some nice holiday style onto a sort of basic just decoration photo. All right, so let's move on to this portrait here. Okay, so for the portrait, I don't think I'm going to crop anything on the shot. I think it's kind of a perfectly just shot composition anyway. So what we can do here is we obviously want to bring out the foundational look before we start going in and adding on our holiday textures and what have you. So inside of our develop tab, inside the camera profile, because this is again a raw image, I'm going to choose a different camera profile just to quickly set the foundational look. So I know earlier I was saying that I was going to use the on-one landscape for the next two photos, but for this particular photo, I forgot that I'm actually going to use camera landscape. So you can see that by clicking on camera landscape, and if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it does a really good job of bringing out the tones in the photo, evening out the exposure, and brightening up the sort of vividness of these fall colors. So that looks really great on the shot. We probably don't have to do probably anything else to the foundational look of the photograph. We can actually probably just start in effects now. So with this particular photograph, what I do want to do is it does look a little bit flat. So there are some areas, especially in the background here, where they could use some nice contrast. So I'm actually going to go in, I'm going to add a filter. And one of my favorite things, one of my favorite filters to add to bring in a little bit of contrast and style are these vintage filters. And so people kind of stay away from these vintage filters because I think they're going to add on a fade and they're going to remove contrast, which they do. But you can always go back in and you can pull up on those sliders to remove those adjustments. So one of my favorites here is this warm style. So if I click on this, it does look really good with just that style applied, but you can see that it does subdue the colors a little bit. So if I just want the sort of that vintagey contrast, but I want the colors back, I can head over to my saturation slider in here, and I'll just pull that back up. And now I have those colors back in my frame, and I can pull back on the amount a little bit so that it's not so strong. And now if I turn this off and on here, it adds in a little bit of contrast, a little bit of fade, and I really like what it does to the overall sort of look of the shot. Since we're going to be adding on different textures and masking on different things to the photo anyway, it's nice to kind of bring in that faded matte look right at the beginning, so the entire process you see what that's going to look like when you have that applied. All right, so if we turn this vintage filter off, it looks really good onto the shot. I really like what that does with the faded look. The next filter I want to add onto the shot, I want to sort of capitalize on the softness of the light in the frame. And the great thing about this photo is that it was shot on an evenly lit overcast day. So with those types of photos, you can put a lot of different adjustments onto it and it will still look believable. And one thing I like to add onto these shots is a sun flare filter. So to bring in sort of that festive, bright, warm holiday look, I'm going to go into my effects tab. I'm going to add a filter and I'm going to add the sun flare filter. So with the sun flare filter, one of my favorite presets here is just that second one in, the sun flare. I'm going to click that, and obviously that's covering her face quite a bit. And it's kind of on a weird side. The left side looks a little bit wonky with it applied there. So what we can do inside the sun flare filter is we can actually flip it to a different side. So I'm going to head into my sun flare filter, and right below the scale slider, I'm just going to click on this arrow, and that'll flip it horizontally. And now it's on the right side of the frame, and that actually looks pretty believable there because it looks like the sun is kind of just kissing in through the frame on the top right corner. But inside of here, on her face, if I turn this off and on, that sun flare is covering up a lot of this area. So what we want to do is we want to remove that from her face. And an easy way to do that is to use the masking brush. So we're going to grab the masking brush by hitting B on our keyboard. So now I have my masking brush selected. I'm going to head up to my top tool modifier bar here, and I'm going to lower the opacity to about 40 or 50. And the reason I want to lower my opacity to about 40 or 50 is because I could brush this out just with 100% opacity and just kind of do it with one swoop. Let's just do it. So I'll pull this up to 100. And if I mask this out with just 100, it really doesn't blend it that well. You can see these areas on the right where it just looks a little bit harsh. So what I like to do is just lower the brush opacity to about 35, 40, kind of in that general area. And then just incrementally brush a little bit away at a time. And then you can get a lot more naturally looking mask on your shot. And then you could always hold down Shift, hit X, and that'll switch your mode back to paint out or paint in or whatever you're trying to do. And then we can go in and paint a little bit back in. Probably lower my brush size here. But then we can paint a little bit back in. So that it's not completely removed from the shot. There we go. So now if I turn the sun flare filter off and on, I really like what it does over on the right side of the frame. I think it looks really good and just bringing in a little bit more life to the frame and also really kind of capitalizing on that soft, even light on the background of the shot. Okay, so now that we have our sun flare filter masked out from the photograph, I want to add just a couple textures onto this shot. For me, when I think of holiday photos, especially holiday portraits, I think of kind of these warm, light and airy portraits. So let's make sort of a light and airy portrait using some different textures. And one of my favorite filters to apply kind of scattered light onto your shot is with a bokeh texture. So what we can do is we can actually go in here, and I'm going to go into my effects tab. I'm going to add a filter, and I'll add another sun flare filter. Because remember, in the sun flare filter, you also have the bokeh textures as well. And I'll go into my type. I'll choose bokeh. And then I'll choose bokeh 11. Yeah, bokeh 11. So with this bokeh, if I turn this off and on, obviously that's incredibly bright. But if we use a blending mode and we blend this on top of our photograph, it's going to look a lot more natural. And it kind of will help create this white vignette and really just draw the viewer's eye into the portrait. So inside of our sun flare filter, I'm going to click on the gear options to grab my blending options. And then for my mode, I'm going to choose soft light. So now with this soft light, it's sort of similar to the overlay blend mode that we used in the last edit. And then it's just going to create contrast within your photograph. And it's also going to blend that texture or that overlay quite a bit onto your shot. So if I turn the sunflower filter off and on here, you can see it's blended it quite a bit and it looks really nice on these top areas, but in her face, it looks a little bit too contrasted. So we can always go over here and I can go down to my opacity and I'll just lower the opacity a bit and then I'll bring it up incrementally until I get the look that I want out of this sunflower filter. I'm probably gonna leave it about right at 50. I think that looks pretty good right there. So now if I turn the sunflower filter off with this bokeh texture, you can see how it helps kind of liven up the light in the photograph and match this sunflower filter a bit more. Where without it, it looks a little bit soft and we sort of have this bright blob to the right of our shot. So we're gonna add one more bokeh texture on our shot. And this is just to bring a little bit more life into the shot. We've kind of primarily blended those other two bokeh textures, or the other bokeh texture and then the sunflower filter. So this is sort of a more prominent bokeh texture within our frame. So I'm gonna go into effects, I'm gonna add a filter and I'll add the textures filter. And I'll go into my category here. And in photographic, I'm going to choose bokeh 12. So if I turn this off and on, it's really warm. So it's incredibly warm on the shot and it kind of just muddies up everything in the frame. So what we can do inside of this texture is we can go down to our tone and color and we'll just lower the saturation to -100. And what that will do is that will lower the saturation for this bokeh texture. So now if I turn this off and on, it's just white and it doesn't actually modify the colors on the shot. So now what we want to do is we want to remove this area to the left here as a kind of distracting point. Looks a little odd just sitting out there in front of our face. So we're going to go down to our texture and I'm going to click on this rotating button and this is going to rotate it. Perfect. And so now we're kind of capitalizing on this sunlight area and we put that little area of bokeh right there. So now if I turn this texture off and on, it evens out the lighting a little bit and it brings more contrast right in here into the subject of the frame, and it brightens up the areas around her, kind of creating a nice white vignette. And so if we hit the # key on our keyboard, just sort of a transformation to a different photo entirely just by using some different textures, a few sun flares, and a vintage filter. All right. So actually one last thing I was going to add onto this photograph. So let's go in here and let's add another filter. And for some reason lately, especially with these warm portraits, I really love adding a borders filter. So now with this borders filter, you can see that if I turn this off and on, it just sort of adds a white border on the edge. But I'm going to head down into this transform area and I'll pull up on the fit image slider and that will fit the image better. There we go. So now if I hit the # key on my keyboard, I really, really like what we've done with that portrait, especially with bringing in sort of that holiday festive look. I think it's done really well, especially with the area on the top right of the shot. All right, so we can get started here with this last photograph. So I have this landscape here, and remember earlier I was saying that we're going to be using the On1 landscape camera profile. Well, this is the shot for that. So inside of the tone and color area for this photograph, I just want to bring out the foundational look again with this shot so we can go into effects and we sort of just have a base look that's not too dark, not too bright. So an easy way to do that is just to use our camera profile menu. So I'm going to go to my camera profile menu and I'm going to choose On1 landscape. So by choosing that, if I hit the # key on my keyboard, you can see it just sort of brightens up everything a little bit. It adds in contrast and it just kind of corrects the exposure in the landscape. But with this particular photo, it looks a little bit too bright right now. So what we can do with this shot is we can lower the exposure a ton and really just focus the viewer's attention on the light in the shot. And an easy way to do that is to head over to our exposure slider, and we'll pull back on that to probably about -2 or so. And by pulling back on the exposure slider, obviously you're going to darken the photograph, but you're also muddying up, your midtones, your highlights. You're basically darkening up everything in your frame. So what you can do to bring back some of that nice contrast is you can actually head down to your white slider, and if you pull that back up, see how when you pull that back up, it basically just makes a moodier photo. So by pulling that exposure slider back, we're dimming everything down, but we're also going to preserve these areas of darkness on the right-hand side of our frame and on the left-hand side by strictly pulling up on the white slider and not pulling up on our shadows or our midtones. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard here, see how it's just focused on this road area now, and we're really just kind of examining the photo for light at this point, and we're not really focused too much on these darker areas in the shot, which is exactly what we want. Now we can go in and we can start adding different filters onto the photo. So for the first filter I want to add, I'm going to go into the effects tab. I'm going to add a filter, and I'll just add the weather filter again. And the weather filter, I love it for landscapes, especially when they're shot on days like this where it's nice and overcast. You can add the weather filter onto a lot of shots and it looks really good, particularly the overcast shots though. I wouldn't recommend adding the weather filter onto shots where you've been shooting on a super bright sunny day because it may look a little wonky, but shots like this where it's overcast and it's nice and evenly lit looks really good with the weather filter. So for the weather filter, I'm going to go into the more preset styles and I'm going to choose sticking. And you can see that by clicking that, it already does an awesome job of bringing in this snowy look onto our photograph. But now we need, but now we need to incorporate that nice holiday style onto it. So what we can do is we're going to actually go into our local adjustments tab. And one thing I want to focus on here is I just want to focus on this road in the middle. And so a good way to do that is to tone down these two areas from the left and to the right. We're going to use a local adjustment gradient. So with my local adjustment here, it's set to darken, but now I'm going to hold down Shift and hit K on my keyboard, and that's going to pull me up my adjustable gradient. So with my adjustable gradient selected, if I want to protect this middle area of my frame and darken the areas to the right and to the left, I can use my shape reflected gradient. So now if I click on reflected gradient, I can drop this down, and you can see it's protecting the middle of the gradient, but it's applying the local adjustment everywhere outside of it. So now I can flip this, or rotate it rather, sorry. And then I can pull in on these solid handles, like that. And then I can feather it. Like that. And then I'll head over to my local adjustment, and then I'll just incrementally kind of darken it just like that. So now if I turn this off and on, I really like what it does. It's just kind of allowing us to focus on that middle area in the shot. Okay, so now we can head back into effects and we can start incorporating sort of that holiday color. So the first filter I want to add to apply some holiday color is the photo filter. So I'm going to add a photo filter, and I'm going to use this 85. So the 85 is going to warm everything up, and you can see it really kind of gives it that warm holiday look, but you can see that it muddies up the road a little bit. So I can hit B on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my masking brush. Now I'm going to head up to my top tool modifier bar, and I'm going to raise the opacity to 100, and I'm just going to mask this filter out from this road. So I'll lower my brush size until it's like right on the road, and then I'll just paint this out. And obviously that looks really kind of unrealistic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to my photo filter, and in my masking options, I'm going to head down, and with this density slider, I can actually remove the density of the mask. So if I want to soften up these areas inside of the mask where I brushed, I can just lower the density, And that will bring back some of that kind of orange warm color on the road. So I'll pull back the density to about 60. That looks pretty good. Sweet. So now we have a nice warmed photo. But one thing I could do with this shot is if I turn this off and on, it's maybe a little bit too strong on some of the midtones in this photo. So what I can do to protect those is I'm just going to go into the blending options for this photo filter. And down here below the Apply To menu, you have these 3 different sliders. And these sliders are used to protect the areas from the filter. So if I want to protect my midtones, I can pull up on the skin slider. And you can see that by pulling up and down on it, it's protecting the midtones in my photograph from this photo filter. So I'll pull up on that a little bit, probably about right there. There we go. And now it's pretty much about perfect as far as the warmth goes for the shot. So one last thing I could do to sort of just bring all of the life back into this photograph is I could just add a filter. And one of my favorite filters for just quickly applying nice style onto a shot is the LUTs filter. And if you've watched any of my webinars in the past, I'm sure you've seen me add a bunch of LUTs filters, but it's just an awesome, awesome filter to apply style. And one of my favorites, especially for warming up images, is the Braniff. I think it's Braniff. Branag. I'm not really sure. But I really like that. But it takes away all of the color in the shot. So we'll head down into our saturation slider and we'll pull up on this. And that'll incorporate that color back into the frame. So now if I turn off this LUTs filter, I really like what that does to subdue these areas around here and really just focus the viewer's attention on this road area. And with these particular photos, I think they look great by adding on text. So if you have a photo like this and you want to add text onto it, just hit T on your keyboard. That'll grab you your text tool. And we could put something like Happy Holidays. Make it centered maybe. Maybe make it really big. Then I can move this. There we go. Sweet. And then if you don't want the text, you can always remove it, but just a good way to add a nice little flair onto your photograph. So I just want to say thanks so much for joining up with me today. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for staying the whole time. I hope you guys learned some quick ways to make some holiday looks onto your photographs. Once again, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. Stay tuned for more On One Live webinars. I'm Dylan, and have a great weekend, guys.